emerging, and to any First Nations persons joining on this call. Tonight we meet to discuss the important topic of the state of democracy and its implications for peace. We're pleased to have two guests with very deep knowledge on this topic. I think everyone on the call would be deeply aware of the phenomenon of democratic backsliding that we're witnessing occur in the United States and in many other countries besides, including countries in our own neighbourhood like the Philippines, Thailand, Myanmar. For tonight, we're keeping the focus squarely on our own country. Tonight, literally right in the middle of an election campaign, makes an apposite moment to reflect on the state of democracy here in our own country. So the format for this evening will be, we'll have two relatively short presentations from Bill and then Julie, each about 10 minutes. We'll then start with a Q&A between members of the panel initially, and then we'll move out to questions and answers from members of the audience, which will be at least 15 minutes, so there'll be plenty of opportunity to participate. Feel free to post questions in the chat, or you can wait and raise your hand when we come to the Q&A session. Please do remain muted if you're not speaking. The session is being recorded, so please turn off your video if you do not wish to be seen. And if you really don't want to be seen, you may also want to change your name to a pseudonym because it will otherwise appear. Okay, so we'll move on to our first presenter. So Bill Maley is Emeritus Professor of Diplomacy at the Australian National University, where he was Professor of Diplomacy from 2003 to 2021. He's also a lawyer, a member of the Order of Australia, a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, and a Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. In November 2003, he received the Oscar Paul Cullen Humanitarian Award for services to refugees. He's the author of Rescuing Afghanistan, What is a Refugee? Transition in Afghanistan, Hope, Despair, and the Limits of State Building. The Afghanistan Wars, Diplomacy, Communication, and Peace, Selected Essays. And most recently, Australia, the Politics of Degraded Democracy. In addition, he is co-author of Afghanistan, Politics and Economics in a Globalizing State, and The Decline and Fall of Republican Afghanistan. And he's the editor of Fundamentalism Reborn, Afghanistan and the Taliban. So please take us away, Bill. Oh, you'll have to unmute.
I'll put it where you are so you can hear it.
Oh, okay. There we are. Thank you very much, Michael, for those kind words of introduction. Normally, in recent years, I've been working mainly on the decline of democracy in Afghanistan, but that was one of the things that prompted me to start thinking about what was going on in Australia as well, because although we don't have a democratic crisis of the kind that we saw in Afghanistan and that we're now witnessing in the United States, nonetheless, there are a number of elements of the Australian democratic system which I think are worrying and worth highlighting, particularly as we're still at a point where we can begin to do things about the problems. What I want to do is say a little bit in background contextualization, make a few comments about particular areas where degradation of the democratic order is going on, and conclude with a couple of comments about challenges. Democracy, of course, is an elastic expression, and it's often qualified with adjectives like delegative democracy, representative democracy, deliberative democracy, participatory democracy, liberal democracy. I tend to use it rather bluntly as an expression to describe a system in which there are institutionalized mechanisms by which ordinary people can change the rules without bloodshed. But that can import other significant elements, such as a legal system which enjoys genuine independence and protections arising not just from law, but also from cultural understandings that make it unthinkable for political leaders to go down destructive paths. But as we're seeing in the United States at the moment, if political parties are replaced by a political cult, then it becomes difficult to sustain those kind of cultural norms as well, and the consequences can be pretty dire. I talk about degradation rather than crisis because crisis can suggest that a dramatic shift in circumstances is likely, whereas what many countries experience is simply a diminution over time in the effectiveness of the operation of particular institutions or structures And cumulatively, that can be very destructive for the functioning of the polity as well, but without the kind of drama that we're witnessing currently in the US, or that we've seen in other countries where there's been a wholesale democratic collapse. That said, when we're talking about the degradation of democracy, we also need to be wary of reductionism that begins to look for just one simple explanation. And very often when things start going wrong in political systems, there are different factors in confluence which together contribute to things going off the rails. And quite frequently, these are developments which on their own might be relatively innocuous, but which in combination with other factors begin to produce consequences that were unanticipated. So let me just highlight a number of spheres of degradation which I've noted in more detail in my recent book, but which I think are significant. One is the decline of Parliament. That Parliament is not a particularly effective deliberative body, although some parliamentary committees do very good work. And increasingly what we see are speeches in Parliament which have no effect on the way in which governments, or oppositions for that matter, position themselves on policy matters. And a distance between members of Parliament and members of the public. And this has something to do with a second problem, which is the mechanisms of elite recruitment. If one went back 50 or 60 years, the bulk of members of the House of Representatives and the Senate were people who'd already built careers of some significance in the communities from which they came. This was spectacularly the case when Parliament was enlarged in 1948 for the 49 election, because a lot of people who came into Parliament had served together in the Second World War and had that experience of working for a cause which was higher than simply party politics. Whereas if one looks at the background of MPs and senators these days, an alarming number have had a limited career trajectory which has taken them from student politics into ministers or MPs and senators' offices, into pre-selection battles, seeing them enter the Parliament without the kind of life experience that would actually equip them to contribute constructively to a lot of discussion that goes on. And this is in part because major parties are more and more patronage networks rather than mass organisations. The ALP, for example, nationwide has fewer members than the Hellenic Club in Canberra. And that's partly because the combination of compulsory voting and public funding of political parties means that major parties don't actually need members. If you have voluntary voting, you need your membership to get other people out to vote on polling day. And if you don't have public funding, you need to raise funds through an engaged membership in order to fund your core activities. But if you have these together, you don't. And Barry Jones actually described this as a kind of bomb shelter that protects the major parties from challenges from their traditional opponents, although not, as we've seen in recent times, from independents who cash in quite effectively on the discontent that people feel with how the major parties are working. We've also seen a diminution in the willingness to kick out ministers who misbehave. In the Menzies era, it was very much the case, one strike and you're out. And so ministers behaved exceedingly well, whereas now we have metaphors of the sin bin where somebody who's been engaged in pretty awful misuse of taxpayers' money can have a realistic expectation of being back in the cabinet before too long. And when you combine that with a congenitally weak National Anti-Corruption Commission, the mechanisms for the prevention of misbehaviour on the part of the executive are not particularly effective. This problem has been compounded by the 1984 Members of Parliament Staff Act, the so-called MOPS Act, which in effect gives members and senators carte blanche to choose who will be their personal staff. And too many offices are populated with brats who have no capacity to keep their members or ministers out of trouble. And if there's one thing that can be said for putting experienced and elderly public servants in minister's office, they have a great skill in keeping ministers out of trouble, whereas the brats too often are interested in playing student politics games out of minister's office. Parliament shouldn't be a playpen, but too often that's how it's functioned in recent times. And there are lots of gruesome examples I'm happy to quote or share that make that point. When one looks at the public service, however, one also finds that there's been a significant amount of hollowing out, partly to do with the loss of permanency on the part of departmental heads, but also because of the pervasive effects of managerialism and the capacity of people to be floaters from one department to another on the basis of alleged generalized managerial competence, which too often proves to be destructive when the going gets tough. And the Robodebt Royal Commission report is a scathing and devastating depiction of how that kind of thing can happen. But we also see it in cases such as the Puzzulo case, which saw the Secretary of a Commonwealth Department being removed because of multiple violations of the Public Service Code of Conduct, and then subsequently stripped of the rank of Officer of the Order of Australia. These kind of things also go in parallel with another disturbing development, which is contempt for the rule of law. And we've seen that over a long period of time. We saw it when, during the Howard government, an attempt was made to insert into the Migration Act a privative clause, the intent of which was to prevent courts from reviewing the exercise of discretion by ministers to determine whether it was in accordance with the law or not. Fortunately, the High Court of Australia held that if certain crucial behavioural requirements had not been met by decision makers, then there was in fact no decision at all, and therefore this particular offensive provision couldn't protect the alleged decision. But the mere fact that members of Parliament would seek to insert such a provision in a piece of legislation was disturbing, and we've seen it in other spheres as well in terms of secrecy around a whole range of different areas of government activity where it's not necessary on credible grounds. And even in things such as the squalid attempt to bug the cabinet room of Timor-Leste in the run-up to negotiations on maritime border demarcation. I remember somebody saying to me, well, everyone does it. I said, no, the Timorese have not bugged the cabinet room in Canberra. And that kind of exploitation of asymmetries of power is not only squalid, but it's pretty disgusting as well. This becomes problematic because of some of the final points I want to raise and also discuss in more detail in my book, which are the kind of challenges which the political system is tasked with confronting at the moment. Some relate to broader societal developments, media power, the development of social media, disinformation, all sorts of claims being circulated, which are difficult to squash even if they get out of control. And literally 2 minutes before I logged on this evening, I was putting something up on social media, squashing a notion that had been put up by some fool to the effect that there were millions of people who'd been brought in as migrants during the period of the current government were brought in to vote for the incumbents, even though under the Migration Act you have to have been a resident for 4 years before you can be eligible for citizenship, which again is a prerequisite of the right to vote. So this was garbage, but it didn't stop people putting it out and it starting to run like a rabbit. There are then some longer term issues which relate to institutions, and you can point to a lot of wider institutions in society which have been debilitated in various respects. The Banking Royal Commission under former High Court Justice Kenneth Hayne exposed a lot of seedy activities on the part of institutions which people really can't avoid using now because of the requirement that payments be made into bank accounts. We've seen it in universities whose governance is currently in the process of being investigated by the Senate Education and Employment References Committee in what can be a very interesting outcome. And we've, of course, also seen very significant changes in social institutions such as the family, which are differently understood now in the way that they were 40 or 50 years ago. But there are also some long-term policy challenges which we need to think about, and we need a robust political system to be able to manage. The gathering of efficient tax revenue, which has really gone nowhere despite the Henry report in 2010. The huge problem of climate change, which I'm now witnessing in mounting insurance premiums for my safe little house in Canberra, where insurance companies are having to jack up premiums right across the board because of large payouts that they're making because of damage from climate change that is hitting different parts of the country. And then the issues of housing and an aging population, which have been coming up from time to time during the course of the election campaign. But beyond this, I think there are a couple of other problems, and I'll conclude with these that are also worth noting. The problem of populism. Populists such as Pauline Hanson are never going to be in a position to exercise executive power themselves, but they can affect a magnetic pull on other political parties. And we saw this very much with the Tampa affair in 2001, which was very much a stunt at the time designed to pick up second preference votes from people who are going to give their first preference votes to Pauline Hanson. This is an enduring problem, and it's one that it certainly is haunting the coalition at the moment, which, if it were rational, would be heading for the centre of the political spectrum, but is for the most part heading for a more right-wing dimensions, partly because of the nature of its own shrinking membership, but partly because of the sense that they need to be able to harvest preferences from Clive Palmer and Pauline Hanson and people of that sort. This is then augmented by a much larger problem, really, which is a disposition to see politics as war rather than politics as policy. Sir Robert Menzies warned against this in an essay he wrote called The Gentle Art of Opposition. And he's been largely ignored by his successors. But once you begin to view politics as a kind of war rather than as a device where, as the public would wish, elected leaders try to cooperate to produce better policy outcomes, then you can lose a lot in terms of effective policy making. And that means that we live in a situation where, despite the fact that we're not in anything like the disastrous situation that the United States currently finds itself, we do need to be vigilant. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Bill. And so much there for us to unpack, but I'll ask if you can hold your questions until after we've had both speakers have a chance to speak. So I'll move on to Julie. Dr. Julie Macken has worked as an investigative journalist with the Australian Financial Review and as a political consultant to both Federal Labor and the New South Wales Greens, has held senior positions with Greenpeace and ActionAid, and has recently graduated with a doctorate that examined the reasons behind Australia's abuse and occasional torture of asylum seekers. Her forthcoming book, Australia's Schism in the Soul, Colonisation, Asylum Seekers and a Nation's Failure to Mourn, tracks the psychological devolution of white Australia since colonisation, a state she describes as paranoid, schizoid, melancholic. She argues both peace and democracy demand a relationship with reality that the relaxed and comfortable Australia has foregone. Over to you, Julie.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thanks very much to the forum for the invitation and for providing a space for all of us to reflect on really important issues. You know, the space for which is contracting all the time. So I'm really grateful for this, and really lovely to hear from Bill. Bill and I go back about a quarter of a century. When I was at the AFR and suddenly Afghanistan arrived on our national horizon, and every journalist was scratching their head going, Afghanistan, what is that? Where is that? And luckily I heard of Bill. So I became the clever kid in the conference room who knew a bit about Afghanistan, care of Bill. I'm taking a different approach, a very different approach, and one that kind of rarely gets a look in, certainly in Australia. But my argument and my kind of way into these issues is to suggest that we need to understand that the policies we produce, the culture that is created by that, and the kind of consequences of all of that emanate from a shared collective psychological landscape. I, along with, Judith Butler and numerous other people, argue that it is actually possible for a nation to have a shared psychoaffective landscape, that in fact every election campaign that we see is an expression of exactly the psychology that is driving us. But that it is imperative that we kind of pull the veil back on the politics, on the media, on the culture, and have a look at the patient, in this case, Australia, their psychological health, our collective psychological health. And to do that, and look, I've got to say, I only arrived at this conclusion because as a journalist, as a political consultant, as someone who's worked in the refugee space for the last, quarter of a century, I could not find a good answer to the question of why we began torturing refugees. I'm pretty old these days, and I remember an Australia of the 70s and 80s and the early 90s. I remember an Australia that used to kind of boast about our human rights standards. We were a country that was envied for our capacity to settle people in a really humane, effective, and efficient way. And that's a country I grew up in. And suddenly, as a journalist, I was reporting on the most horrific abuses that we were perpetrating on the most vulnerable people. And I looked high and low for an answer to that. And the political, the media, the economic answers failed to come to grips with the devastation of what we were doing. And also, what I was really curious about is two things. One, when John Howard came to power, he would break out in hives if anyone suggested that we deal with something symbolically. To say sorry, he was not up for anything like that. He'd engage in practical reconciliation, but nothing symbolic like saying sorry. And also increasingly, the nation ourselves, the Nauru tapes, work from SBS, from the ABC, from, at various times, even from the AFR, would produce evidence showing the most appalling abuse. And there'd be like a lightning strike on a darkened landscape. There would be briefly illuminated this Australia that we would look at and go, whoa, that can't be right. And then the awareness would slip from view. Nothing stuck in a way it would have stuck previously. So I went looking for answers. And in the end, for me, one way to understand what has happened to a country I absolutely love is a paper done by Sigmund Freud in 1917 called Mourning and Melancholia. And in that paper, it's a very short paper, but in it, Freud is trying to come to grips with, he's working with the injured and wounded of the First World War. And he's trying to understand why some people, despite the devastation of loss, are able to go through a mourning process and come through it still able to love, still able to live, fully alive. And other people cannot go through the mourning process. They get stuck in what he called a melancholic state, which he described as being half alive, being superficial, complete narcissist, with a kind of tale of sadism traveling through their lives. And I looked at that and applied it to Australia. Is that what's going on in Australia? Are we stuck in a melancholic state, and has it always been thus? And my answer to that was that what we are, melancholia is contingent on denial of loss and denial of love. And what we have denied for 230 years is the violence of colonisation. And we've denied that in all sorts of ways. We've produced policies and terra nullius. We've done a whole lot of stuff to enable our denial of the violence. But that because Freud said, if we're in denial about that, we can only live a half life. We lose our vitality. But the break in that psychological state came in the early 70s, when, for a host of reasons, I'm sure most of you will remember, the denial began to break down. The pain of First Nations people, the pain of recognising Australia's violent colonisation broke through into the national conversation. It broke through when we saw Whitlam pour the red dust into Vincent's hands. It broke through the Redfern speech. We were a nation for about 20, 25 years. We were coming to grips with the reality of our colonisation. And it is unsurprising, it is completely in accord with the nature of mourning in this kind of frame that Freud uses, that is a time characterised by explosive debate and creativity and new policies and, land rights, women's lib. It was an explosive time when we were asking questions about ourselves. Who are we? What are our values? What do we think about ourselves? What flag do we want? What anthem would we really like? What do we look like here? That is what mourning produces. Mourning produces, Freud described it as this kind of erotic vitality that explodes as we move through and sift through the truth of it, where we've come from, in a psychological way. And I say that while we're psychologically going through that process, it has real world production. It produces things. 1996 comes along, and I'll never forget that interview between Liz Jackson and John Howard on ABC Four Corners, when John Howard said what he would really like for all of us is for all of us to be relaxed and comfortable about a lot of things, but relaxed and comfortable on condition that we don't look back, that we stop saying sorry, relaxed and comfortable that we avert our gaze from where we've come from and the truth of where we've come from. And, 47-seat majority followed that relaxed and comfortable. We couldn't get enough of that. And you do a deal here. We do a deal with the devil over this stuff. You don't get to be relaxed and comfortable without paying a terrible price. And the price we've paid is that we have, tipped back into a very melancholic state, a state characterised by a loss of love, a loss of imagination and empathy, a narcissism that can't move past itself, and a sadism. And, for my research, I looked at that sadism in relation to refugees and found it expressed there. It's a psychological state that is supported by splitting, what Melanie Klein called splitting, where we get to be the all good Australians and we project the all bad onto the other. And we are in a extraordinary historic moment right now. We're about to give $400 billion in the middle of a cost of living crisis. We're about to give $400 billion to a crazy guy who's told us he's not going to give us the submarines anyway. And you would think any nation that's really struggling to cover costs of hospitals and schools and all the like would scream blue murder about that. No, there's half a dozen people that are upset about it, but apparently everyone else is cool. There is terrible things going on here. We've got unprecedented loss of trust. We have terrible mental health. We have a despair and a hopelessness that is permeating the place. And yet none of it is sticking. We're not coming together. We're not kind of galvanizing. We're not saying enough is enough. We're in the middle of a federal election campaign. The world has just been tipped on its axis, and we're kind of just buffing our nails and tossing our locks and going, oh, you know, we'll sort it. It's really inappropriate. Like if we were a patient in a crisis behaving the way we are behaving, any mental health practitioner would be concerned. That's where we're up to. My hope and my belief is that for, you know, I love that Bill talked about democracy as a degraded thing. We can't even manage a good crisis. That's how kind of lacking in vitality we are. It is a degraded thing. The only hope I see for us is not actually we need different policies. Of course we need different policies or a different political framework. My hope is that if we can get back into the state of really, once again, accepting the reality of this nation with its violence and its displacement, all of it in tooth and claw, if we can once again get back, you know, have the leadership that brings us to an understanding of where we came from, we will reconnect with reality. And, you know, once we reconnect with reality, that vitality and energy starts to animate these half-dead things that we're kind of dragging around behind us. For peace and democracy, we need three things. We need love. We need to care. We need to absolutely care. We need imagination, and we need vast amounts of energy. And those are psychological elements, which is why I think we need to take the health of our nations psychologically. I think we need to take it dreadfully seriously because we're very unwell. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks very much, Julie. So we've had two very different perspectives on this question of the state of Australian democracy, that not in the sense of divergent, but just coming from very different perspectives. I'd like to offer to Julie or Bill, if either of you has a question in the barrel for each other, I'll give you the opportunity to ask away now. Otherwise, I have one if neither of you do.
Well, why don't you ask yours, Michael, and we'll take it from there.
Okay. I think both of you, in your own way, would, this is a relevant question. So more than 20 years ago, I was part of those marches, as probably a lot of people on this call were, about the Iraq War. Enormous public opposition to the Iraq War. And John Howard just ignored the biggest protest march in Australia's history and public opinion and went ahead with it. In the time since, there's been a campaign to have a reform of war powers, and it seems stalled. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And I just wanted to, each from your own perspective, of what your reflection is on that. Like, is there hope that we could have some kind of accountability over the war powers?
Well, I might just make a couple of comments to start with. It's sometimes, I think, yes, it's sometimes argued that the nature of unanticipated attack makes it necessary that the executive have exclusive right to respond here. But if we think back to Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt still went to the Congress the following day to secure a resolution in order to endorse the action that he proposed to take. And I think one can argue fairly credibly that if there really is a compelling case to respond, for example, to an unprovoked armed attack, one will be able rapidly to mobilize legislative support for the kind of action that one proposes. People would recall Roosevelt's reference to the 7th of December 1941 as a date that will live in infamy, and that was widely shared. The only person who voted against the resolution was Jeanette Rankin of Montana, who'd also voted against a similar resolution to enter the First World War. I think one of the problems that was particularly associated with the Gulf War was that it's now clear with hindsight that Prime Minister Howard misled the Parliament when he said that the government knew that Iraq had relevant weapons of mass destruction. I think he would have been on firmer territory politically if he'd said that had grounds to suspect that. But once he made a claim to knowledge rather than people had a right to expect that the evidence that he was able to access, but we as citizens could not, would be absolutely compelling evidence. And as it turned out, that simply wasn't the case. And this is one reason why ever since then I've been very skeptical when people have talked about all the wonderful information that the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangements provide to Australia, because if it was as good as the intelligence that said that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, then we're the suckers who will never expect to get an even break.
Thanks, Bill. Julie, did you want to?
Only that, look, if we cared enough, I think that it is not at all difficult to mobilise a communications campaign that says we should go to war slowly. There should be guardrails around how we put young kids up in the line of fire and how we kill other people. There should be guardrails about that. So I think if we actually cared about that, that would be possible. But honestly, you know, we are nightly watching a televised genocide right now, and we've seen Australia implicated in the supply of some of those weapons that are a part of that. And I can assure you the rallies for Palestine and the outrage about this is so muted, it's shameful. So this is why I have no doubt that, you know, an ad agency would take all of 20 minutes to knock together a messaging campaign for the War Powers Review. But it means nothing until we are able to care. And that's why I think it is really imperative that we regain our capacity for caring, however much that sounds like a hippie kind of ambition. Without it, we are cactus.
Thanks. John Langmore, I can see you have a hand up. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thanks very much. I was very concerned with William's statement. I thought it greatly oversimplified. Of course, there are some of the things that he was saying, and of course, Parliament is an imperfect instrument, but it's people are very varied, and there are many people there who are there because they have ideals, because they have a well-developed sense of what reforms are needed in the community. It is surprising some of the things that don't get enough attention, but many of them are getting more, and that's very positive. It was tragic about the organisation that there should have been for First Nation people to express their and develop their opinions and resolve the conflicts within their own community so that they can be more effective in arguing for them nationally, and so on and so on. But I think it was oversimplified misleadingly, William, and I think you should also recognise the extent of very hard work, real caring, and the constructiveness of many of the things that are agreed.
And John, I wish I could share that perspective, and I think it was probably truer in the past than it is now. But when it comes to the crunch, I think one of the great problems is that members are now putting aside the committees, which I think have a different dynamic within them, very much suppressed from giving voice on the floor of the Parliament to any particular perspective which is not in accord with the dictated line of the party of which they were a member, which in turn will likely reflect what decisions have been made in the party room. And part of the problem now with the argument that one used to hear that there's real debate in the party room is that factional power within political parties also becomes a constraint on discussion in that particular realm. And I think it's become much worse in recent years than it was in the past. And we see circumstances in which, for example, outstandingly talented members of the caucus on the ALP side, but you could make a similar point about the coalition parties, are failing to be promoted to positions to which they might legitimately aspire, not because they lack talent, but because they lack connections. And one famous example at present is Andrew Leigh, who was one of the most gifted members of the Parliament, but has only been able to obtain a relatively minor position as an assistant minister when we have ministers in much more senior positions who are, by any criteria, much less gifted. And that's not just one political party. You can apply it to quite a number of others as well. And frankly, I think this is one of the reasons why the Teals are a rising force, and why the last couple of opinion polls have shown that that voters in the coming election seem disposed in greater proportions to support independents or small parties than the major parties. It's actually the first time in Australian history that the primary votes of the two major parties have fallen short of the combined primary votes of independents and other candidates. And that, I think, reflects a broader sense in the electorate of a plague on both your houses. And just one anecdotal point here, talking to people who've been involved in lobbying MPs around refugee issues, and I've been involved in this for 30 years, currently in the Refugee Council. Those who've been lobbying independents, the Teal independents, have found it a very different experience, because when they went to talk to elected MPs, what they typically encountered was talking points from the party projected back in their faces. Whereas when they made points to some of the Teal independents, their experience was that people really listened. And I think that capacity to listen and to give voice in a general sense, not just until they've been squashed by a factional boss, is one of the things that has made these kind of candidates much more appealing in the wider electorate.
Thanks, Bill. We'll have to move on to give some other people a chance to get a question in. Julie, I'm going to combine two questions in the chat that I think are kind of related. So one person asks, what are your suggestions to break through and take a profound look at colonisation in Australia? And that's Pamela. And then Dashani asks, what is the role of peace builders in acknowledging past atrocities to move forward in the present day?
Great. For the doctorate, part of my research was talking to a number of psychiatrists who'd worked with refugees and asylum seekers over the last 20, 25 years about their experience. And separately, they all made a really curious comment, which I didn't realize they'd all made until I actually looked at the transcriptions from the interviews. But all of them said that in their experience, the asylum seekers and refugees that became psychologically well, and what one of them called were able to maintain the sacred core of themselves going through the detention experience even after years, were the ones who took really direct, extremely visceral political action. The ones that were engaging in hunger strikes, in lip sewing, in the terrible scenes that we all saw, even though they were terribly disturbing images, they all noted that those invariably they were guys. Those guys got out of detention psychologically intact. The ones that failed to come out of that process psychologically intact were the ones who were quiet, who followed orders, and who didn't resist. And so I got back to all of them and I said, are you suggesting that political action is a kind of mental health strategy here? And they said, absolutely it is. Absolutely. Political action is a mental health strategy for people stranded in these terrible, devastating situations. So I looked at that, and then I looked at what was happening in the lead up to the last election under Scott Morrison's, the end time of his regime. And I noticed that there was huge amounts of political roiling going on. You know, there was the Women's for Justice March, there were Black Lives Matter, there were the kids' climate strikes. There was a whole lot of actual political action. And for me, that is where change comes from. That is where we can begin to see, because all of those political processes are naming the truth in different ways. They are naming some very difficult truths for Australia. And we get well like that. That's actually how we get well. Talk about a robust democracy. We get well in democracies. I think it's Wendy Brown in one of her books has argued that democracies need the muscle of protest. We need to push against, and we need to do that in public spaces, and we need to do that with each other. That's how we get well. So I think there's a great deal to be said about just that. And I can't remember the second part of your question, Michael. Sorry.
I kind of folded it all about acknowledging past atrocities.
Oh, yeah, we can't have, it's the old thing. You can't have peace without justice. We can't have justice without acknowledging reality. We are crazy. We are mad people to imagine we can make up some fantasy past where we were the heroes and the good guys, and we just happen to be given this great country. What a bonus. Like, you can't grow big and strong on lies. We can't have peace. Like any relationship, personal, familial, friendship, you can't have strong relationships built on denial of the facts. You just can't. And nations are the same. We are the same. This stuff isn't rocket science. It's just accepting that as a nation, we are the same.
Thanks, Julie. There's a question from Weiss, which I'm going to direct to Bill to have a go at answering. We've had a lot of diagnosis of problems. Weiss asks, what do you think can improve democracy? Do you have any prescriptions for what can remedy some of these problems that you've identified?
I think one of the things that would be most effective would be a period in which minority government forced the major parties to engage with a wider range of political opinions. And that the spectacle of that happening can itself be something which then invigorates grassroots activity, because people begin to think that there's a greater opportunity to break through the Procrustean constraints that established political party structures have imposed. This is not something which we should fear. I think for all but 3 of the last 44 years, the government of the day has lacked an absolute majority in the Senate. So there's nothing particularly unusual about governments having to negotiate with crossbench political players in order to try to secure the passage of legislation. But it might well be the case that, given the character of the people who seem most likely to be crossbenchers in a future parliament, that this could be a pathway towards some much better legislative outcomes. And it's debilitating if one's trying to animate people to be active at grassroots level if there's a pervasive sense that it's all pointless, because the way in which the system has come to be configured is one which militates against any attention being paid to what people at the grassroots have to say. But if you get to the point where there seem to be real channels through which grassroots opinion can actually start influencing policy outcomes, then you can actually get in a sort of efflorescence of social activity that can be very positive within a society.
Julie, did you want to add anything?
No, just that I really agree. If what we do matters, we do more of it. You know, if as citizens, what we do actually matters. It was interesting, Michael, when you referenced the Iraq, you know, that massive protest against the Iraq war. And Howard, I remember that day, referred to these historic marches as a mob. And he didn't listen to a mob. And he didn't listen to the mob. And we didn't keep doing it. Like we didn't keep doing it because it didn't matter. That was a very powerful thing and a powerful way to say, you don't matter and we didn't matter. It's as central as that.
We've probably got time for one more question if someone wants to raise their hand or it's got a burning question that hasn't been put yet. Actually one's just appeared in the chat. There was a mention earlier of Timor-Leste, which is now rated as the strongest democracy in Southeast Asia. What have they been doing right? Does anyone have the expertise to take that one on?
I'd make one comment, which is that in Timor, they've had a parliamentary system where the presidency has been a kind of unifying symbol rather than the head of executive government. They also had a crisis in the early life of the Republic, which I think proved in the long run to be very very constructive. It led people to back away from the edge of the precipice. And when you have decades of conflict and circumstances in which there may be low levels of trust between different political actors, the temptation to engage in brinksmanship can be quite strong and pretty dangerous as well. But sometimes a hot crisis like that has the effect of maturing the judgment of different political players. And I think that was very much what happened in Timor. The other factor that's been significant there has been the youth of the population and the disposition of those young people to see education as a critical pathway out of the difficulties which the country inherited from decades of occupation. And that on the whole has been something that has also been supported by the political elite. So it's a very interesting case because it took a very different direction from, say, Afghanistan. But the final factor is that they have not actually had to fear the neighbourhood. Timorese relations with Indonesia in the period since independence have probably been less problematic than with Australia, where the disposition to try to twist or exploit the Timorese has been rather unseemly. But there's a great deal of intermarriage between Indonesians and Timorese. For example, people come and go regularly from East Timor to West Timor. That relationship and the regional structures surrounding Timor-Leste more broadly have been very different from what a lot of other conflict-ridden countries have encountered.
Thanks very much, Bill, for that answer to a question without notice. Catherine has a question, and we might make this the last one.
Yes, Julie, it seemed you were being slightly critical of the people demonstrating for Palestine, that they were not being vocal enough. Have I did that right?
No, thank you for raising that. No, I'm totally not. I'm there most weekends myself. I am not at all critical of the people turning up. I am enormously critical of the people who aren't turning up. I'm enormously critical of anyone who can look at what is happening in Gaza and shrug their shoulders and go, not my business. My criticism is wholly and solely levelled at them. The Palestinian people in Australia and their friends have done an extraordinary, sorry, not sure if you can hear me.
Julie, you're muted as well. Yeah.
Sorry, the Palestinian community in Australia and their allies have been extraordinary in turning up in the teeth of an indifference that I find quite obscene. So, yeah, just thank you for the opportunity to clarify who I was furious with.
All right. Thanks. On that sobering note, please thank our speakers. We are nearly at the hour. So, yeah, that was a pretty chock full hour of information and more that we can take away and sit with. In the remaining couple of minutes, I do want to pass to the Australian Peace and Security Forum Treasurer, Russell Rollison, to give you a little preview of a report that we're about to release, but he can explain it better than I can. So Russell, please take the floor.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks, Julie and Bill, for very thought-provoking contributions from both of you. Thank you. We're about to publish, this is the Australian Peace and Security Forum, about to publish the first of a series of what we're calling quarterly reports, our Peace and Security quarterly reports. They will address the four major areas that we're interested in, and the first one is going to address issues in the defence and regional security of Australia. So it includes something on AUKUS, addresses issues of Australia-China relations, nuclear arms, AI weapons, international rules-based order, conflict prevention. So they're going to be available from next Tuesday on our website, and we hope we might attract a little bit of media around the launch, but we're planning to launch it on Easter Tuesday, the 22nd. And so have a look on our website when you next get a chance and look for the Peace and Security quarterly reports, the first of what will be 4 each year. Thanks, Michael.
Great. Thanks, Russell. All right. So thank you very much for joining us for this hour, and watch out for news of the next webinar and the quarterly report as well through our emails. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a good evening.